Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this month's Patch Tuesday webinar by Manage Engine. First of all, I would like to thank all of you for taking time off your busy schedules and joining in. Here's a quick intro about me. I am Anupam Kundu, a product specialist at Manage Engine. Today, I'll be your presenter, and I'm also assisted by an expert panel who would be answering all your queries throughout the webinar. So if you have any questions regarding the presentation, the webinar, or any of our products, please feel free to ask. Now this is going to be a quick 45-minute session followed by a question and answer session. Also, this webinar is being recorded and the recording would be made available on the Manage Engine site in 1 to 2 working days. So without further ado, let's start with the agenda of today's webinar. First of all, we'll take a look at the latest cybersecurity news that made the headlines from across the world. Second, we'll discuss in depth the breakdown of Microsoft's Patch Tuesday updates for the month of May. Third, we'll be discussing the impacts and effects that these patches, these vulnerabilities can have if left unpatched. Followed by that, we'll be sharing the best practices for patch management that you can use to secure your hybrid networks. And last but not the least, we'll have a question and answer session wherein our expert panel would be answering all your queries. So let's begin with the cybersecurity news. Now, the need for cybersecurity requires no introduction. With rising cyber attacks being a constant, admins have no choice but to be vigilant at all times. With that in mind, let's have a look at the top cybersecurity news that made the headlines from across the world. So first up, we have reports of a critical bug being exploited publicly in F5 Big IP. So as you already know, F5's Big IP is an application delivery controller. Now, speaking of the vulnerability, it has been tracked as CVE 2022-1388, and it allows unauthenticated users to launch arbitrary system commands, create or delete files, and disable services on the big IP systems. Security researchers have demonstrated how hackers can exploit using just 2 commands. I repeat, hackers can exploit using just 2 commands and headers to target and access an F5 application endpoint named Bash, which is exposed to the internet. Speaking of the mitigations, F5 has released a detailed set of mitigations to prevent exploitation. So you can find more about the mitigation steps in their security advisory, and the link to the advisory will be shared in the chat shortly. Moving to the next news, so we have reports of a remote access Trojan named as Nervian Rat, which has been targeting entities in Italy, Spain, and the UK. So what is this Nervian Rat? Now, coded in the Go programming language, this is a malware that leverages COVID-19 safety measures to run phishing email campaigns. Now, the messages pretending to be from the WHO or the World Health Organization urges the potential victims to open a macro-laced Microsoft Word document. Once opened, while the doc shows COVID-19 guidance, the embedded macro triggers an infection chain that delivers the malware named updateuav.exe. I repeat, the malware named updateuav.exe. Do note that this malware also acts as a dropper for the Nervian Rat. Now, the malware can log keystrokes, capture screenshots, and execute arbitrary commands before exfiltrating the results back to the server. Speaking of the mitigation steps, organizations should make use of anti-phishing and anti-spam software while maintaining proper hygiene practices. So with that, we come to the end of the latest cybersecurity news. Now let's take a look at the Microsoft support and Windows lifecycle. So dear folks, as you can see on your screen, that for Windows 10 version 1909 for enterprise and education, and Windows 10 version 20H2 for home, pro, and pro for workstations, the active support and the security support has ended on the 10th of May 2022. That is recently. So for users who are still on these old versions, it is highly recommended that you migrate to newer versions such as Windows 10 version 21H1 or Windows 11. Now, we'll be discussing the 0 days that have been patched this month. So we can see that a total of 3 0 days have been patched this month. Let's discuss them in detail. First up, we have a vulnerability in Windows LSA. We have the 0 day bug in Windows LSA. Now do note that this 0 day vulnerability can cause a anti-LAN manager relay attack using a flaw in the LSAR PC interface. Now using this attack, the threat actors can intercept legitimate authentication requests and use them to gain elevated privileges. This has been tracked by the CVE ID CVE 2022-26925, and do note that this 0 day bug is being actively exploited. Speaking of the second 0 day vulnerability, we can see the bug in Windows Hyper-V. This is a publicly disclosed vulnerability and can cause denial of service. Now, third and last, we have a 0 day vulnerability in Magnitude Simba Amazon Redshift ODBC driver. This is yet again a publicly disclosed vulnerability that has been tracked by the CVE ID CVE 2022-29972 and can cause remote code execution in the vulnerable systems. Now, we'll be discussing the critical vulnerabilities that have been patched this month. So we can see that a total of 7 critical vulnerabilities have been patched, and do note that Microsoft has released 8 critical updates, with one being an advisory. Now, the ADV 22001 consists of upcoming improvements to Azure Data Factory and Azure Synapse pipeline infrastructure. Now, this advisory is in response to the critical vulnerability in Magnitude Simba Amazon Redshift ODBC driver that has been tracked by the CVE ID CVE 2022-29972. Also do note that this critical vulnerability can cause remote code execution in the vulnerable systems. Apart from that, we have 3 more critical vulnerabilities here in remote desktop client, in Windows Active Directory, and in Windows Kerberos. Now do note that these vulnerabilities can cause remote code execution and elevation of privilege in the vulnerable systems. Now coming to the second slide. So we see a total of 3 vulnerabilities, with one being in Windows Network File System and the other 2 in Windows point-to-point tunneling protocol. Also, all 3 of these vulnerabilities can cause remote code execution in the vulnerable systems. I'll pause for a while so that you guys can take a screenshot of the CVE IDs. Now moving on, let's take a look at the total number of patches. So we can see that a total number of patches, that is a total of 342 patches, have been released in May so far. And we are glad to announce that all of these patches can be supported by Windows, by Manage Engines, I beg your pardon. Or I'm glad to announce that all of these patches are supported by Manage Engines Patch Management Solution, that is Desktop Central, Patch Manager Plus, and Vulnerability Manager Plus. Now, speaking of a detailed breakdown of this Patch Tuesday, we can see that a total of 119 patches and 46 vulnerabilities have been released to, and 46 updates have been released to mitigate 73 vulnerabilities. Also do note that these 73 vulnerabilities can have 6 different impacts on the vulnerable systems. Speaking of the operating systems and the applications affected, we can see 98 vulnerabilities in Windows, while 4 in Microsoft Office and 1 each in Microsoft Exchange Server and Microsoft .NET. Now, classifying the patches by impact, as I mentioned earlier, that the vulnerabilities can cause 6 different impacts on these systems, starting with 23 vulnerabilities that can cause elevation of privilege, 22 vulnerabilities that can cause remote code execution, and 17 vulnerabilities that can cause information disclosure. We also have denial of service, security feature bypass, and spoofing. Here's a classification of the patches released in this month's Patch Tuesday based on their severity. So we can see that of the total number of patches, 88.6% of the patches have been classified as important, while 8.6% of the patches have been classified as critical. Now, let's take a look at the operating systems and the applications that have been patched. So we see that updates have been released for Microsoft Windows, Office, Exchange Server, and .NET. Speaking of the Microsoft Windows vulnerabilities, we see that these have been rated as critical, moderate, and important, and the failure to patch these can cause remote code execution, elevation of privilege, information disclosure, spoofing, security feature bypass, and denial of service. Let's take a look at the CVEIDs for the Windows vulnerabilities. So here's the list. Also do note that this CVEID that has been highlighted is a critical vulnerability. Ladies and gentlemen, you can get the entire list of CVEIDs from Manage Engine's Patch Tuesday blog or forum post. I'll pause for a while so that you guys can take a screenshot or make a note out of it. Moving to the next slide, we see 5 more critical vulnerabilities here. These have been highlighted. And finally, here we have some 18 more CVEIDs, and luckily we have no critical vulnerabilities in them. Now, let's talk about the Microsoft Office vulnerabilities. Now, these vulnerabilities have been rated as important and can cause remote code execution and security feature bypass if left unpatched. Speaking of the CVEIDs, we see that only 4 of these vulnerabilities have been listed. Here are their CVEIDs, and no critical vulnerabilities are found in them. Next, we come to the Microsoft Exchange Server vulnerability tracked by the CVEID CVE 2022-219778. This vulnerability has been marked as important and can cause elevation of privilege. Last but not the least, for Microsoft .NET, we see that this vulnerability that has been rated as important can cause denial of service and is tracked by the CVEID CVE 2022-30130. Now, here's a look at the third-party updates for Windows that have been released this Patch Tuesday. So we see some major vendors rolling out updates such as Google Chrome, Foxit Reader, WebEx Teams. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I'll pause for a while so that you can take a screenshot of the updates. Also do note that all of these list of updates is available in Manage Engine's Patch Tuesday blog or forum post. Here are some other updates for third party that has been released this Patch Tuesday. We have Remote Desktop Manager, Foxit Reader, Microsoft Visual Studio Code, and others. Now, coming to the Mac updates, we see some major updates released in the Microsoft family, that is Microsoft Word, Excel, Outlook, OneNote, PowerPoint, and also in Google Chrome. I'd like to reiterate again that you can get this entire list in Manage Engine's Patch Tuesday blog or Patch Tuesday forum post. Speaking of the non-security Office updates, we see just one update has been released for Microsoft Access 2016. Now, dear guests, the graph on the screen clearly depicts the steep rise in vulnerabilities each year. As we can see, a total of 10,409 vulnerabilities were reported till July 2021. Now, such an alarming rise in vulnerabilities only iterates the dire need of patching to protect the endpoints in a network. With that being said, we'll now have a look at the best practices for patching in a hybrid network. So first up, always test the patches before deployment. So as a thumb rule, always test the patches in a test environment before deploying them to your production machines. Now do note that as an ideal test environment, the test group or the pilot group should consist of all the flavors and versions of the operating systems that you use in your environment. So once these patches have been successfully tested, we can roll them to the production environments. Number two, always prioritize the security and critical updates for all the machines. Any other less severe updates or feature packs or optional roll-ups can be sent in the respective deployment schedules. Number three, synchronize the patching schedules with the monthly patch Tuesdays. So by syncing the patching schedules with the monthly patch Tuesdays, you can ensure that the patches are tested, approved, and deployed as soon as they are released. So this gives you a head start for achieving patch compliance in your network. Number four, it's most important, that is, it is highly recommended to set broad deployment windows for the remote machines and also to choose non-business hours for the office machines, especially the servers. Now, this has to be done to protect the systems from system downtime and also to protect the organization from a productivity drop. And we come to the last but not least best practice, that is, you can allow users to have the option to postpone the deployments and the reboots. So what happens is that many a time users are stuck with business critical activities. So in certain cases like that, forcing deployments, so in certain cases like that, forcing deployments and reboots to these users can seriously cause productivity drops. And as admins, we definitely don't want that, right? So in that cases, it is recommended to allow the users the option to postpone the deployments and the reboots. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we are done with the best practices that you can follow for patching in a hybrid environment. Now, let's take a look at deploying the patches and updates using Patch Manager Plus. So if you're using Desktop Central or Vulnerability Manager Plus, you can still deploy the patches seamlessly as the patching module is same in all of these three products. So let's start with the testing of patches. Now, as already mentioned, the first step is to always test the patches in a pilot group of systems before deploying them to the production machines. Now, always remember that the pilot group must have all the versions and flavors of the operating systems being used in the network. So let's test this test and approve feature by moving to the Patch Manager Plus console. So this is Manage Engine's Patch Manager Plus, and I'm using the version 10.1.2137.12. This is the home page. We have the network patch status, the system health graphs listed. We have also listed the missing patches by severity by vulnerability. On the right side of the screen, you can see the latest cybersecurity news. On clicking that, you'll be taken to Manage Engine's Patch Tuesday blog or the forum posts that contains all the latest cybersecurity news. Coming back, so we were talking about the automated patch deployment feature. So for that, we'll be going to deployment. We'll be clicking on deployment from the top menu, and then we'll click on test and approve from the left pane. So as you can see on your screen, the test groups have already been created. Let's now go and create a new group. We'll click on the add group button. Now, dear guests, the first step is to choose the platform. So we offer three different platforms, that is Windows, Mac, and Linux. You can test your Windows patches on Windows endpoints, Windows platforms, Mac patches on Mac platforms, and Linux patches on Linux platforms. So going with Windows, next, we'll be choosing the custom group name. You can either choose it from the drop-down menu or you can create a new custom group. So let's create a new custom group by clicking on Create Custom Groups. So once this loads up, we'll be able to create a new custom group. So as you can see, these are the listings of the custom groups that have already been created. Let's go ahead and create a new custom group. We'll click on Create New Group. Now the first step is to choose the group name. Let's go with May PT1. All right. You can add in a description if you want. And the second step would be to choose the category of the group. Now do note that there are three options, that is static, unique, and dynamic. But our custom group, that is a test group, always has to be either static or static unique and never dynamic. Now why not dynamic? Let's explain that in detail. See, when I click on dynamic, we see a set of criteria. So basically, a dynamic group is based on a certain set of criteria. Let's choose the criteria as operating system equals, and let's go with Windows 11. Yeah. So what happens is that the custom group that would be created, that is a dynamic custom group that would be created, will be based on this set of criteria, that is operating system equals Microsoft Windows 11. So in this case, any endpoint, any device that runs on Microsoft Windows 11 and gets added to the network will automatically be a part of the custom group. And for test groups, we definitely don't want that to happen, right? So I'll go with static or static unique, choosing static. Okay. Now next will be in adding the computers. Now that's added, and we'll click on save. So as you can see that May PT1, our custom group, has been created successfully. Now about the automated patch deployment task. Sorry, the test and approve feature. All right. So for that, we'll click on deployment from the top menu, and we'll click on test and approve from the left pane. Yeah, as I already mentioned, we'll click on add group to create a new group. For Windows, going with Windows. And for the group name, we have already created a group that is May PT1. We'll be selecting this. Now, the next step is to choose the the updates. So in the deployment option, we can choose the Microsoft updates based on their severities. I'll be choosing critical and important. You can obviously go as per your needs. Next, we have the option to either patch all applications or patch specific applications or patch all the applications except the ones that we select here. So I'll be going with patching all applications. For the third-party updates, we'll be choosing them based on their severities, going with critical and important. You can also choose antivirus updates and driver updates. Here is a list of the antivirus updates that we support, but do note that the antivirus updates and the driver updates are specially meant for the Windows platforms. That is, these two features are available only for the Windows platforms. Next, we'll choose the deployment criteria. So here what happens is that you can direct it, like if you want to deploy the patches after n number of days from vendor release, you can just specify by putting the number of days here. So if I go with 2, this means that I choose to deploy the patches after 2 days from vendor release. Our next step would be to choose the deployment policy. You can either create or modify a policy by clicking here, or you can select a policy from the dropdown. Let's go with this policy. Now, followed by that, we have the notification settings option. Now, dear guests, do note that this is an optional setting. And if you want to be notified about the test and approval of the patches, you can just click on the checkbox, enable the notification, and put in the email addresses wherein you would like to be notified about the testing and approval. So if you have already configured the mobile application, you can just choose the technicians that need to be notified via the mobile application. And lastly, we'll choose on the approval mode for tested patches. Now, if you want the tested patches to be automatically approved, just click on the checkbox and then specify the number of days. So here this means is that I choose to automatically approve the tested patches after 2 days. Now we'll click on create, And we can see that our May PT1 test group has been created successfully. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. Next, dear folks, let's discuss the automated patch deployment feature, and we'll also create deployment policies based on the Patch Tuesday split. So what is this Patch Tuesday split? We'll discuss all of these in details by going back to our Patch Manager Plus console. So before I demonstrate, I'd like to say that creation of an automated patch deployment task is a two-step process. The first task is that is the first step is to create a deployment policy. And the second step is to associate an automated patch deployment task to the deployment policy. So for that, we'll click on deployment from the top menu, and then we'll click on deployment policies from the left pane. So here are the deployment policies that have already been created. Let's go ahead and create a new policy by clicking on create policy. You can rename this. Let's say May, okay, May policy. You can add in a description if you want to. I'll click on save. Now the first task is to choose the weekly split type. You have two options. Either you can go with the regular split or manage engines exclusive based on Patch Tuesday split. So let's discuss about those. So if you choose the regular split, we can see that the weeks have been listed based on the first week of the month, the second week of the month, third, fourth, and last. You can choose in the days and also choose in the deployment window. Now, if you choose Manage Engines exclusive based on Patch Tuesday split, what happens is that the weeks are listed based on the Patch Tuesday. So we'll be leaving the Patch Tuesday week for the testing and approval, and we'll go with the first, second, and the third week. We'll be choosing the days right from here, and also we'll be selecting the deployment window. We'd like to keep it as broad as possible. If you want, you can add more than one schedules by clicking on Add More Schedules button. Next, we have to download the patches from the server to agent. Now you can do this either only during the deployment window or anytime the agent contacts the server. But do note that even if the download happens, the deployment will only happen during the specified deployment window. Going with the second option. And lastly, we'll have to initiate the deployment either at system startup or the 90-minute refresh cycle, or either of these, whichever happens earlier. Going with the last option again, and we'll click on save and continue. Now, the second step is to choose the pre-deployment activities. Now, what are these pre-deployment activities? Now, let's say that if you want certain activities to happen in the endpoints before the deployments of the patches are about to begin, you can choose it right from the pre-deployment activities. We offer Wake on LAN feature to wake the computers on LAN. We also offer pre-deployment reboot, and this is an exclusive feature that is the custom script option. So what is this custom script? So let's say that you want certain custom activities to be performed on the endpoints before the deployment is about to happen. Like you want an application to be closed, application that is running in the endpoints to be closed before the patch deployment is about to happen. So for that, you can create a script and add it to the script repository. And here you can just simply import the script from the script repository. So we'll click on save and continue, and we'll go to the third step, that is the pre-deployment user notification. So if you want to notify the users about the deployment, you can just click on the checkbox and you can add a custom message. You can configure the notification timeout, and we also allow the option that you can allow the users to either skip their deployment, or if you want to show the deployment progress on the client systems, you can just click on this checkbox. Clicking on save and continue, and we come to the last step, that is the post deployment activities. So if you want certain activities to be performed on the endpoints after the deployment has happened, you can choose the post deployment activities. You can choose to post the reboot or shutdown, or you can choose the custom script. Do note that the possibilities are endless with Manage Engine's exclusive custom script feature. So clicking on save and continue. And here's a brief detail of the deployment policy. Here is the name of the policy, the deployment schedule, the pre-deployment settings. Once we skim through, if all's right, we'll click on save and continue. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we can see that our May policy has been created. Now, as I said earlier, that creation of an automated patch deployment task is a two-step process. First, we'll create the deployment policy that we already created, the May policy. Now, we'll be associating this deployment policy with automate patch deployment task. So for that, we'll click on deployment from the top menu, and then we'll click on automate patch deployment from the left pane. Here you can see the automate deployment patch deployment tasks that have been already created. So let's go and create a new task by clicking on the automate task button. We'll be going with Windows. Now let's rename this. Let's go with May APD 1. You can put in a description and we click on save. Here we'll be choosing the updates for Microsoft based on their severities. I'll go with my own preference for demo purposes. Of course, you can go as per your needs. For the third-party updates, going with critical and important. You can also choose the antivirus updates and the driver updates. So here is a list of the antivirus updates, but do note that the antivirus updates and driver updates are exclusive, are available only for Windows endpoints. Now, the last step is to choose the deployment. Now, you can choose to deploy the patches after n number of days from either release or from approval. So if I go with 3, this means is that I choose to deploy the patches after 3 days from either approval or release. I'll be going with approval. Clicking on next. Now the second step is to choose the deployment policy. So you can either create or modify a deployment policy, or you can choose it from the drop-down. We just created a policy that was May policy, I believe. Yeah, right. Here's a brief description of the policy. Also, if you want this automated patch deployment task to be suspended after a particular time, you can just click on the checkbox and then put in the date and the time. Clicking on next, going to the third step is to choose the remote office or the domain. You can choose the remote office or the domain from the drop down. And if you want to exclude certain targets, you can do that by just using the exclude target filter. Next, we come to the last step, that is the configuring of notifications. So if you want to be notified about the download or the deployment failure for after every n number of hours, you can just select it from the box and you can just put in the number of hours. If you want detailed reports on the failures to be attached, you can just click on the checkbox and choose the format that you want. We offer 3 different formats for the reports, that is PDF, CSV, and XLSX. You can put in the email IDs wherein you'd like to be notified about the download and deployment failure. And as usual, if you have already configured the mobile application, you can just select the admins, select the technicians that need to be configured. So we are done with this. And now let's click on save. So as you can see, our May APD1 automate patch deployment task has been created successfully. All right, coming back to our presentation. So to quickly summarize, the creation of an automated patch deployment task is a 4-step process. First, we'll be choosing the applications based on their severity. We have Microsoft updates, third-party updates, antivirus updates, and driver updates. Next, we'll choose the deployment policy. You can go either with the regular split or you can choose Manage Engine's exclusive patched user split. Number 3, we'll be defining the targets. And if you want to exclude certain targets, you can just click on the filter button. And the last step is to choose the configuring of notifications. So you can put in the email addresses or you can choose to be notified via the mobile application. All right, folks, now let's have a look at some of the other exclusive features that Manage Engine Patch Manager Plus offers to ensure seamless patching. So we'll begin with filtering out Patch Tuesday updates. Now we can directly filter the updates released on Patch Tuesdays right from the console. For that, let's head on to the console. Now to use the filter, we'll click on Patches from the top menu, and then we'll click on Supported Patches from the left pane. So once this window loads, you can see the supported patches in your environment. To create the filter, we'll click on Filters, and then we'll click on the plus button. So you can rename the filter if you want. Now we'll be choosing the criteria. So we'll choose the release date is, and then we'll be putting in the custom date. The date for the Patch Tuesday was 10th of May 2022. So we can see the criteria is release date is 10th of May 2022. Now we'll apply. And so once the filter has been applied successfully, we can see the patches that have been released in this month's Patch Tuesday right here. That is the release date equals May 10, 2022. You can also use this filter to look for the missing patches in your environment that were released on a particular date or on the Patch Tuesdays. So for that, the procedure is just the same. We'll click on missing patches from the left pane, and then we'll choose the filters and we'll create a new filter by clicking on the plus button. Okay, we're done with the filtering of Patch Tuesday updates. Coming back, let's talk about another feature. So we have a feature called the declining of patches. Now, what is this and why is this required? So many a time, there arises the need to decline certain applications. Let's say you don't want to deploy less critical patches to your machines, but if you choose to ignore them, it will end up affecting the system health compliance, and definitely we don't want that. Also, certain applications running on other software, such as Java, might be unsupported with the latest updated version. So for scenarios like these, Manage Engine's patch management solutions bring the exclusive decline patches feature. So let's go to the console and we'll check out the decline patches feature. For that, we'll be going to patches from the top menu, and then we'll click on the last option from the left pane, that is decline patch. So dear folks, as you can see that groups have been already created to decline patches. Let's create a new group by clicking on select group and decline patch. Now the first step is to choose a custom group. You can either create a new custom group by clicking on the plus button, or you can choose one from the drop down. Let's go with this. Next, we'll be putting in a description if you want to. We'll click on next and we come to the second step. So here, some patches have already been added for declining. Let's show you how to add patches. To add patches to be declined, we'll click on the add patches button, and then we'll be choosing in the patches from this listing. I'm going with some random patches, and I sincerely hope you guys don't do that. Next, we'll click on add. Now, dear guests, we also offer the ways to decline either patches, applications, or families. So to decline the applications, we'll click on the applications tab, and we'll click and on the add applications button, we'll click. Let's decline an application. Let's go with Able Word. Let's go with Active Directory, and we'll click on add. Now, if you want to decline entire families, we'll just click on the family tab, and then we'll click on the add family to decline button. Here we can see, let's click on 7-zip and some other random product, Adobe Reader. We'll click on add. Now, if we click on, oh, there's a Mac patch selected, let's remove that. And then let's click on next. So ladies and gentlemen, the summary details shows that 6 patches, 4 applications, and 3 families have been declined. To save it, we'll click on the save button. And now you can see that the patch group April PT decline patches group has been created successfully. Now, dear guests, on your screen, you can see the solutions that Manage Engine offers for seamless patch management. We have our flagship product, Desktop Central, which is a unified endpoint management and security solution. We also have an MSP version of the product. Next, we have Patch Connect Plus that smoothly integrates with SCCM and Intune to ensure third-party patching. You can use Vulnerability Manager Plus to scan and mitigate vulnerabilities and compliance issues in your network. And last but not the least, we have Patch Manager Plus, our standalone patch management solution to ensure seamless patching across the network. So with that, we come to the end of the 45-minute session. Now we'll have a question and answer session. So if you have any queries regarding the webinar, the products, or the presentation, please feel free to ask via chat.